Anything new with Korn?
Oh, yeah, Korn.
Korn.
Oh, yeah, Korn. You bet.
Korn, absolutely. Korn, yeah, absolutely.
Korn is always interesting.
It's Korn.
Hey guys, RanterInShades here, exercise my First Amendment rights vlog style, and it's time for another episode of What's Wrong With.
What's wrong with me? You wanna know what's wrong with me? I can ask you the exact same thing. What's wrong with me?
Well, this episode's been overdue for long enough, so I've got one question for you guys, and one question only.
Are you ready?
I mean, I've been promising a What's Wrong With on this band for God knows how many years, so you better be ready. Because we're talking about Korn, with a K and a backwards R. I've had every intention of making this episode since pretty much the beginning of my channel, since Korn's always been a band that's caused quite the stir in the metal world. But as time went on, I kept finding myself having no idea how I would go about putting this video together. The Punk Rock MBA once made a video about what he calls the 10-year rule, where he talked about how the general metal/punk community consensus regarding Slipknot, NoFX, and The Devil Wears Prada became more positive over time, since it's rare that you see much people bash those bands at all compared to back in the day. And I feel Korn is another band that's went through that arc, since I haven't been hearing much negative about them over the course of the last decade, even when I was making my list of bands I want to talk about for this series. I've even come across metal elitists that normally hate nu metal make an exception for Korn. So you're probably wondering why I'm even making this video at this point. Well, aside from the fact that a lot of people have been wanting a What's Wrong With on Korn for the longest time, in addition to me promising it for years and the topic just so happened to be bouncing in my head, for as much as Korn's reputation has gotten more positive over time, there's still that sect of people that have it out for them for the impact that they've made on metal. In order to understand where that sourness comes from, we gotta go
Back in the 90s.
When we think of rock and metal in the early 90s, one of the first things, if not the first thing that comes to mind is grunge and how it dethroned glam metal as the dominant style of rock in the mainstream. Hell, the most viewed video on my channel is all about up-and-coming bands at that time from that style that were given the short end of the stick thanks to this almost overnight shift. Obviously, grunge didn't kill glam, since genres never die as long as there are bands still making the music and people still listening to it, but even the biggest names from the glam scene could only get so lucky after 1992 to release an album to widespread commercial success. There's a quote from Johnny Lane of Warrant, may God rest his soul, from 1995, recollecting when the band was meeting with their label, Columbia Records, in 1992 to discuss promotion for their album Dog Eat Dog that I always think of when I think of this period of time. I'll never forget walking into Columbia Records president Don Iner's office and seeing this huge poster of Alice in Chains. I thought, hello Seattle, goodbye Warrant. The 90s in general is seen these days as the decade that rejected all the trends and styles of the 80s. Even on TV shows, you can see the piss being taken out of a lot of 80s things, such as The Simpsons subverting the traditional sitcom archetype that was so prevalent throughout the previous decade, and Beavis and Butthead roasting 80s bands like Winger. And for as much as I love my 80s media, I can't help but feel like a big part of why the 90s is seen by my generation as this wonderful time period where so much great content flourished that defined our childhoods has a good bit to do with how much it went out of its way to not be like the conservative yet goofy 80s, but it's for that reason that a lot of 80s metal fans tend to look at the 90s as this dark, gloomy time period that changed things for the worse, when really, from a creative perspective, the exact opposite was the case. One thing I mentioned in my Why I Hate the Rock is Dead argument video was that had rock and metal continued sounding like the 80s, they would have accelerated down the road of sounding more and more stale and uninspired, and its stagnation would have gotten it to grow increasingly irrelevant. But thankfully there were bands countering that potential by bringing new sounds to the table. I'm not even talking about just bands from the grunge scene like Soundgarden, the Melvins, Mother Love Bone, and Alice in Chains. I'm also referring to the early alternative metal bands from the late 80s, early 90s. Bands like Faith No More, Jane's Addiction, Helmet, Rollins Band, and Body Count, along with early industrial metal acts like Fear Factory and White Zombie, and Rage Against the Machine, who I finally saw the reunion tour of, Living Colour, Primus, and even early Red Hot Chili Peppers on the funky side of things. A significant factor in why the big cultural shift of the 90s happened was that the rock and metal audience was wanting something new, and that's what these bands were brewing up. New sounds that were interesting, experimental, and hardly much at all like the styles of rock and metal that we associate with the 80s. And through that, we were introduced to something even weirder, a genre dubbed nu metal. I should mention that I don't really like using the term nu metal, since it was a term coined by the media to describe metal bands that were new at the time, and they chose to spell it NU since I guess it fit the edginess that these bands were known for. And I don't know about you, but in 2022, I'm not sure we can really get away with calling these bands from the 90s and early 2000s new. I've always considered nu metal to be under the umbrella of alternative metal. I mentioned this when describing Billie Eilish in Best Songs of 2019, but the label alternative was originally given to rock bands that were seen as an alternative to the arena hard rock of the 80s, and when you combine that with metal elements, you get alternative metal. And nu metal is certainly an alternative to the 80s metal genres. I get that there are distinctions between alternative metal and nu metal, such as the aggression in the riffs, slap bass lines, and even rap vocals that aren't really associated with bands like Breaking Benjamin, Seether, Chevelle, and of course Alter Bridge that have a more accessible sound, but I tend to see those as stylistic choices that vary from band to band, since I don't see much of a stretch between the overall production styles, if that makes sense. For the purpose of this video, I'll make things easier for everyone and use the term nu metal, because when it comes to Korn, they were the band that truly solidified the sound that we know as nu metal. Korn were a band that took a few years to really click with me. My introduction to them was probably the same as a lot of you watching this video, through their best known song, Freak on a Leash. I remember feeling somewhat confused my first time listening to the song. The guitar part in the verses sounded like something you'd hear in a rap beat, and the vocals ranged from soft-spoken to more yelly to whatever this is. I knew I was hearing something unique, but I wasn't sure if I liked it or not. I would go on to give Korn another try after other bands in the nu metal classification like Deftones, Disturbed, System of a Down, and Nonpoint, aka the band that does the song I use in the intro for the series, made a good impression on me. I figured if I could get into these bands that had this kind of a sound, then maybe I'd get Korn better than I initially did, especially with the significance that they hold in not just metal, but music as a whole. I remember saying in the What's Wrong With I did on Pantera years ago that they were a band responsible for keeping metal alive in the oh-so-bleak and depressing 90s, and mentioned feeling similarly about Korn. While Pantera had their thrashy groove riffs, thundering drums, and juicy guitar solos akin to 80s metal, along with innovating that scoop the mids guitar tone so many bands would emulate, Korn were experimenting with a new sound, much like the early alternative metal bands I spoke about earlier had done, and they took it to the next level. Like I said earlier, I don't believe genres truly die as long as there's still an audience and bands still making the music. Grunge might have been the popular rock style of the early 90s, but that doesn't mean that there weren't people that were still devoted to certain acts of the 80s. After all,
Grunge tried to kill the metal. They failed!
And all this is leaving aside the fact that 80s styles like glam, thrash, and traditional heavy metal weren't the only metal genres other than alternative metal that existed at that point. But if we go with the idea that metal did suffer a fatal blow at the hands of grunge, Pantera and Korn were perhaps the biggest bands by the mid-90s breathing life back into it. Even if I didn't like Korn, there would always be a level of respect I'd have for them because of this. And in retrospect, I think most people would agree. The albums of theirs I gravitate to the most are the first 4 albums. Albums like Untouchables, See You on the Other Side, and the Untitled album do have their fans, and I do hear some respectable things about their more recent output, but those first 4 are the ones I would call the classics in their discography. My favorite of those 4 would be their self-titled debut. It has a particular rawness to it, both lyrically and musically, exploring such themes as abuse and bullying. Not to mention, along with great tracks like Ball Tongue, Clown, Faggot, like YouTube would let me get away with pronouncing that any other way, and Blind, the song you heard in the beginning, the album contains my favorite song of Korn's, Chutes and Ladders, with its title being a charming play on the board game Chutes and Ladders, and its lyrics parodying children's nursery rhymes, which I always found really funny. And it even opens with Jonathan Davis playing bagpipes. What other metal band was doing that? To me, this song is the ultimate representation of what Korn is all about. Shock, real-world brutality, and subversion, and those themes are present throughout the rest of the tracks on the album. Their second album, Life is Peachy from 1996, is certainly a worthy follow-up to their debut, containing a lot of their best-known songs like Adidas, which has nothing to do with shoes given that it stands for All Day I Dream About Sex, No Place to Hide, Porno Creep, and even a cover of an Ice Cube song, Wicked, featuring Chino Marino of Deftones. But 1998's Follow the Leader, the album Freak on a Leash and Got the Life Come From, and not to be confused with the Eric B. and Rakim album of the same name, is probably their album that's the most fondly remembered. Even while also having songs like It's On, Dead Bodies Everywhere, Seed, Children of the Corn, and even All in the Family, it certainly helped that the album also had Ice Cube and Fred Durst guesting on those latter 2 songs, which gave off a vibe that all these guys were real buddies with each other and coming together in this rap and rock community that was establishing itself. And this became really apparent when Korn put together the Family Values Tour, for as short-lived as that ended up being. It was basically their Still DRE moment that showed that they really valued and loved their community. Issues, which that band most definitely got their name from, is also one of my favorite Korn albums. With songs like Fallen Away From Me, Let's Get This Party Started, Make Me Bad, which a certain man who owed Goofy money named his YouTube channel after, and Jingle Balls, which I talked about in my Christmas songs video, it definitely built off the momentum from Follow the Leader. I mean, for fuck's sake, the album literally came out a year later, and the fact that the album doesn't sound like it was rushed should really say something about not just their work ethic, but also their commitment to making the albums great. A big thing that made Korn stand out was their sound. While alternative metal, industrial metal, and funk metal were all established genres by the mid-90s, there was never a band that sounded like Korn prior to then. They essentially took elements from alternative metal, grunge, hardcore, hip-hop, and funk elements with the bass playing from Fieldy Arvizu and the drumming from David Silveria to create something truly ballistic. Fieldy's bass tone and slapping is definitely one of the defining characteristics of Korn's sound, and Silveria's syncopated and groovy drumming is excellent on the albums he played on. He left the band in 2006 and was replaced by a guy named Ray Luzier, who previously played with David Lee Roth and the supergroup Army of Anyone that also featured Robert and Dean DeLeo from Stone Temple Pilots and Richard Patrick of Filter. As great of a drummer as David Silveria was in Korn, Luzier is also excellent, and it really enhanced the experience of seeing Korn live at Mayhem Fest in 2014. I'd been curious for a while about how they sounded live, and they probably put on my favorite performance at that show. And this show had Avenged Sevenfold headlining, so that should really say something. Oh fuck, this isn't gonna attract some leftover bullshit from 2014, is it? Brian Head Welch and James Monkey Schaefer are also very good guitarists. Korn's riffs have always been really bouncy and energetic, and while nu metal isn't exactly a genre that's known for having a lot of lead guitar work, they've definitely had their moments where they did some funky stuff. Along with that, as I alluded to earlier in this video, another key characteristic of Korn's guitar parts are those moments where they sound like record scratches and other assorted rap noises, kinda like what Tom Morello brought to Rage Against the Machine, though admittedly not as wild as Morello. It's also worth mentioning Head's 2008 solo album, Save Me From Myself. He had left Korn in 2005, not too long before David Silveria, got clean, and became a born-again Christian. The album details a lot of what he was going through, spiritually and personally, but it doesn't beat you over the head with religious bullshit like you'd expect from someone who had recently found God. This would also serve as the basis for his band Love and Death that he formed in 2012 as a rebranding of his solo band. Although Head had also rejoined Korn around this time, I always appreciated the kind of outlet Love and Death served for his more personal material, and they're a solid alternative metal band as well. Head's always been my favorite member of Korn thanks to the level of musicality he brought to the band with his parts, and that helps give me an appreciation for both his solo work as well as his work with Love and Death. But of course, I wouldn't be talking about Korn's guitarists without mentioning the big thing that the band brought to the fold, their use of 7-string guitars that they had tuned to A standard. For those of you that don't play guitar or understand guitar terminology, standard tuning for guitars on a 6-string instrument has the strings tuned to E, A, D, G, B, and E. On a 7-string guitar, a low B string is typically added, and all the strings are tuned a whole step down to A, D, G, C, F, A, and D for playing in A standard. Korn were by no means the first band to play extended range guitars, since the Swedish progressive death metal band Meshuggah, who are known these days as the godfathers of djent, had been using these instruments as far back as 1991, as well as the Tampa death metal band also using them by the mid-90s, along with Michelangelo Batio having a high A string instead of a low B on all 4 of the necks on his signature X guitar when he played with Nitro. But Korn certainly popularized the concept. They actually got the idea from guitar virtuoso Steve Vai, who had a 7-string signature guitar with Ibanez in 1990. Regardless of who was the first to utilize these instruments, they didn't just become a staple in nu metal, but a staple in metal in general across multiple genres. And then there's the vocals of Jonathan Davis. If there's any word I could use to describe him as a vocalist, it's dynamic. His singing might not be technically impressive, but he puts on quite the performance. And I'm not even just talking about the Throughout a given song, he'll start out quiet and soft-spoken and gradually up the intensity in his delivery. The chorus will have him do some loud belting that matches the aggression in the instrumentation, and from there, his tone ranges from having a growling delivery to sounding like he's losing it. And no song showcases this better than Daddy, the closing track on the self-titled. This song contains possibly the most emotional and grueling performance Jonathan's ever vocalized, and we'll talk more about why that is later on in the video. Of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the South Park episode Korn was featured in, Korn's Groovy Pirate Ghost Mystery, which is definitely my favorite of the show's Halloween specials.
How funny that this video is getting uploaded in October. Happy spooky season, everybody.
Unlike in most South Park episodes that feature a celebrity being impersonated, poorly, their words not mine, Korn actually guest starred in this episode, along with their friendly weird animal companion, Nimblets. They even play Fallen Away From Me at the end of the episode, almost like a little promotion for Issues, which would be released a couple weeks later after the episode aired in 1999. The episode may be a silly parody of Scooby-Doo, but I've always found Korn's feat in the episode really charming.
Korn powers Vitalize!
Monkey, David,
Fieldy,
and
Jonathan!
Form of Korn!
Much like how artists like Marilyn Manson and violent video games like Doom were made out to be scapegoats in wake of the Columbine shooting, I also can't help but feel like the town's reaction to Korn in the episode is referencing how a lot of out-of-touch boomers felt about the band and the influence they had on the culture at the time.
Yeah, and how about Korn playing the big concert tomorrow? Pretty exciting, huh?
Korn is a devil-worshipping group that plays violent music. If we allow that demon band to play on this most unholy of holidays, we may incur the full wrath of evil.
An observation I've made about a lot of different people in society, including myself at times, I'll admit, is that people tend to fear what they don't understand. And with the brand of counterculture that Korn represented growing more and more widespread, this South Park episode is definitely a reflection of that. And I think that's a good way to segue into the part where we debunk the flag. I guess that's my Jonathan Davis impression. It isn't out of the ordinary for a band to have a weak period where they release albums that aren't as fondly remembered. The albums that Korn released in the 2000s were always known to be hit or miss. Some would argue it's not much of a coincidence that most of these albums came out after Brian Head Welch and David Silveria left the band. But that said, some people really like the songs Comin' Undone and Twisted Transistor from See You on the Other Side, or Here to Stay from Untouchables. Ironically, the album of Korn's Jonathan Davis attributes as being his favorite. They've had their moments, but on the whole, I wouldn't say I care much for the albums released in this period either. But as you should know if you've been following the series long enough, a few unmemorable or even mediocre albums are never enough to destroy a band's legacy or ruin their discography, especially when Jonathan Davis himself has spoken about not thinking incredibly highly of these albums in retrospect. But the one album of Korn's that's really divided their fan base and is still heavily debated to this day is of course their 2011 album, The Path of Totality. This is the album where they collaborated with dubstep artists to create a nu metal dubstep fusion, metal step if you will. Some would call this Korn chasing a trend or selling out, but I've always seen it as the band trying to experiment, akin to what they did when establishing their sound in the beginning. As much as I'm not huge on this album myself, I'd be lying if I were to say I didn't respect its existence. This was Korn shaking things up and trying something new, which is the main thing I admired about them in the first place. And I don't even like dubstep, hence the reason why I put the album's lead single, Get Up, featuring Skrillex, at #1 in my Guilty Pleasures video that I really need to make a sequel to. So that should say something. Even despite that string of albums, it is comforting to know that, along with Head rejoining the band in 2013, the albums they put out following Path of Totality have been much better received. My friend Mortified Productions, who's probably the biggest Korn fan I know, featured 2016's The Serenity of Suffering and 2019's The Nothing in his favorite albums list of their respective years, and spoke quite highly of the latter album given the circumstances it centered around. Jonathan had lost both his wife and mother within a month of each other, resulting in the album being perhaps his most personal work in such a long time. But on the note of that, another common complaint about Korn I've seen a lot in the past is how angsty and emo their lyrics are. Irrespective of the sound associated with emo, the definition I've always had of it amounted to lyrics that are overtly sad and personal, which of course transcends multiple genres. A song I could easily use as a counter to these kinds of dark lyrics being a bad thing is Fade to Black by Metallica, my favorite song of theirs. It's a song about a man's desire for and eventual suicide. Could that not be considered emo? It's actually for this reason that I don't really like using the term all that much. Another example I have of a metal band writing something deeply personal that always comes to mind is a song from our old friends Warrant, I Saw Red. This song is about Johnny Lane walking in on his girlfriend in bed with his best friend, an event that traumatized Lane to the extent that it delayed the release of Warrant's debut album, Dirty Rotten Filthy Stinkin' Rich. Certainly more vulnerable than you'd expect from a normally fun genre like glam metal. The point I'm getting at is that A, there's nothing wrong with emo lyrics, B, they aren't specific to nu metal bands or even pop punk bands that they're commonly associated with, and C, lyrics that could fall under the categorization of emo can amount to more than,
my girlfriend left me. I'm jealous of all the popular kids at school. My mom grounded me from playing Xbox. My dad took my phone away for a week.
And other such first world problems. So to bring things back to Korn, their lyrics may be angsty, but it's not as if they aren't without reason. They're known to be uncomfortably real. A classic example of this is of course Daddy, which contrary to popular belief isn't about Jonathan Davis being molested by his father, but rather by a babysitter and his parents not believing him. Like I said earlier, this is perhaps Jonathan's most grueling and emotional performance, especially when he breaks down towards the end of the song.
Fucking
how much of a traumatic and scarring event this was in Davis's life, it's not a wonder the song gives off such an effect. Another thing that could potentially be brought up about Korn is their role in the infamous Woodstock 99, an attempt at a revival of Woodstock in honor of the show's 30th anniversary. My buddy Atticus the Death Metaler made a good video about this event for his Death Metal Historian series that I recommend checking out if you'd like to learn more about it. On the surface, this show looked awesome. In addition to Korn, the lineup also featured the likes of Metallica, Rage Against the Machine, Red Hot Chili Peppers, The Offspring, Limp Bizkit, Sevendust, Ice Cube, The Roots, Godsmack, Jamiroquai, and many more. Much like how that When We Were Young festival that was announced at the beginning of this year is basically an ultimate time capsule of alternative music in the 2000s, this is the kind of lineup that appears to us today as an ultimate time capsule of music in the late 90s. However, this event is regarded today as being poorly managed due to a number of factors. The overwhelming heat with the show taking place at an upstate New York airstrip with lots of concrete, the pricey water and long lines for drinking fountains leaving hordes of people dehydrated, and porta potties overflowing causing the people to stew in their own shit did more than enough to render the 4-day-long festival a disaster. But that's nothing compared to what happened during a few noteworthy performances. Limp Bizkit's set saw fans literally breaking stuff. The Chili Peppers set saw fans using the candles that were distributed for them to light during their performance of Under the Bridge to create bonfires that spiraled out of control, with singer Anthony Kiedis comparing the fires to that of Apocalypse Now. And Korn's set saw some instances of sexual assault and even gang rape taking place. Now, Limp Bizkit got the brunt end of the deal by the media, since they were already kind of a punching bag and made for an easy scapegoat, but it's nonetheless unfortunate that any of this had to occur, let alone at a festival that looked so promising. I'm sure there were more than a few people blaming Korn for what happened during their set, as if they had any knowledge of it going on. But if we're being honest, was that really Korn's fault?
No.
Concerts of this magnitude can bring out the rowdiness in a lot of people, and the environment it took place in did not help at all. I'd sooner call this the fault of the show's organizers, as well as people just being stupid fucking idiots, than I would any of the bands performing. This contrasts with the incident at Astroworld last year, where people died in an excessively violent mosh pit during rapper Travis Scott's set, not just because he's the founder of the festival, but because he was actually aware of what was happening and didn't stop the show.
Ambulance in the car. Whoa.
From his perspective, I can understand if he might have been freaked out by what was going on and didn't know what to do in that moment, but it's his irresponsibility that was why he was blamed for that incident. I don't think that's something you could say about any of the bands performing at Woodstock 99, let alone Korn. But honestly, the main complaint about Korn that rises above all else boils down to, well, them being a nu metal band. It's basically transitive property logic. Nu metal is bad, and since Korn are basically the originators of what we know as nu metal, therefore Korn is bad. It doesn't even matter that they weren't the first band to combine metal with alternative, funk, and even hip-hop, nor the first band to play on a tuning lower than E standard, or play on 7-string guitars, nor that Jonathan Davis has gone on record in the past saying he doesn't like considering Korn as being nu metal. They're to blame and they must die. It really just boils down to a distaste for the genre more than a distaste for the band. Look, I get that nu metal isn't everyone's cup of tea. I knew this even when I began my crusade against metal elitists way back when, but if I may, I'd like to share a perspective. You remember in my Megadeth video when I said that thrash metal is arguably the most important metal subgenre because of the rift it drove in the 80s metal scene that helped it to move forward as a genre? Well, I feel a similar way about nu metal. Love it or hate it, it brought some much needed experimentation to metal so that it wouldn't sound like the 80s forever. That's not to say there's anything wrong with sounding like the 80s, as there are a number of bands that came around after that era that have that kind of a sound that I very much enjoy. But once again, if nothing new is being brought to the table, it only makes it easier for the genre to fall off. Simply put, metal needed nu metal. Metal is one of the few genres of music I can think of that has as many variants as it does, and nu metal is just one of those many. And along with bringing something new and interesting to the table musically, it helped keep metal afloat in the mainstream at a time where things felt more or less bleak. As I've said numerous times on this channel, as much as a sect of rock and metal fans bemoan the idea of the music being popular, mainstream acts are ultimately what attract new people to the scene and entice them to learn more about it and do their own exploring. And in the mid to late 90s into the 2000s, Korn was that band for a lot of people. That's why even if Korn might not be my favorite band ever, I'll always have a deep level of respect for the impact they've made on metal. Even if one such way is leading guitarists down the path to playing 76-string instruments tuned to drop Q. So now here's the part at the end of the video where I ask you, the viewer, what's wrong with Korn? Please be rational when leaving your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching this video, take care, and have a nice day. I'm Shades, and I'll see you next time.